Okay, continuing that story we just heard. Joseph has a rocky time in Egypt. First, he's a slave. Then he gets accused of rape, and he gets arrested and put in prison, fully expecting to die there. Some things happened there that kind of changed his fortune, and he got elevated to one of the highest positions in Egypt, in charge of the production of grain and the storage of grain, which put him in a perfect place for when the famine came that he had foreseen through one of Pharaoh's dreams. Joseph's brothers back in Canaan, famine hits there too. They hear there's grain in Egypt. They come to get grain, not expecting to find the brother they had sold into slavery in charge. So, leaving out a lot of details, Joseph's family finally actually moves to Egypt, and they settle there, and now Jacob dies, the father. And so that's where we pick up the story. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of your servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as God is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Again, a word of God that is still speaking. Thanks be to God. New York Times columnist David French, he's one of the presenters in the faith and politics class we're doing on Monday nights. He was telling about an experience of his when he was a soldier in Iraq. He said that he had gone to Iraq to basically fight for these higher ideals of freedom and Christianity and faith. And he was expecting to find people motivated by political and religious differences, fighting over those things. He said he was surprised to find that the true motivations had nothing to do with politics. They had nothing to do with control of the land or anything like that. No fighting over ancient theological splits between the Sunni and Shia branches of Islam. Instead, they were fighting over personal grievances. The example he gives is a Sunni member of the insurgency might say, "A Shia killed my cousin, and that's why he was fighting." It wasn't this big, grand scheme of things. It was, "This happened to me," and that's why they were fighting. French said that experience really impacted the way he saw our own political fights when he got home. He realized that the polarization that had become so entrenched in our politics isn't really about good and evil or good or bad policies or even about democracy. It's about grievances. The Democrats did this to me, or the Republicans did this to me, or they made this decision and it affected me this way. Our fighting, he said, when we really get down to it, is about personal grievances. I think he has a point. When I drive to church most days, I like to listen to Washington Journal, and if you've never listened to it, it's on C-SPAN. I have to go away from it every once in a while because I just can't stand it, but they have open phone time, and they have a line for Democrats, line for Republicans, line for independents, and anyone could call in and talk about whatever they want. And I like to listen because I want to know what people think. I want to know what people from all sides are thinking and what's motivating them. And I do switch sometimes because sometimes just so off the wall. It's just both sides, all way off the wall. And the language that they use just to really demean people, there are times I just have to turn away from it. But I always go back because I want to hear what they're saying. And what I found as I listened to them is kind of what French found in Iraq. People were not arguing over big policies. They were saying, this happened to me, and that's why I'm voting this way or leaning that way or something like that. They are talking about how things that any administration has done that affected them personally. Or they're afraid of how something might affect them personally. So with that background, I invite you to think about your own impulses with this upcoming election. What is truly motivating your choices? What upsets you or scares you the most about what may happen? And why? For a lot of us, our politics are governed by our own grievances, things that have happened to us that we've experienced that haven't gone well, that have had a negative impact on us, minor or major, things that have been promised that we've hoped for that never materialized, wrongs that have been done that haven't been fixed, things that aren't fair, all those kinds of things. But when you really drill down to it, those grievances for us are real. They're not imagined. So often our first instinct is we hear someone else talk about their grievance, we want to dismiss it and say, no big deal. I don't know why they're so upset, but it's real to them. Unfortunately, instead of our first instinct being to work together to resolve that grievance, we pull out our guns, we sharpen our knives, and we prepare to go to battle to defend our view of what's right, our view of how things should be. Thinking about the deep divides in our politics in those terms really gave me a different kind of an insight into what's happening in our country. Perhaps most of us catch ourselves thinking about those in a different political camp, wondering how in the world smart, intelligent people don't see through the smokescreen of their chosen candidate. How can they not see the danger that lies ahead on the road that they are on? Of course, remember, everybody who's thinking different than you is asking the same question of you. How in the world can you not see? But what if we stepped back and asked ourselves, what's the grievance that's motivating them? What wound do they carry that leads them down that path they're on? And ask that question of yourself, too. What grievance lies behind your choices? What hurt or fear have you experienced that you think only your chosen candidate can alleviate? Now, you might be wondering what this has to do with Joseph and our scripture reading. In a way, the story of Joseph is something of a microcosm of what we're facing today. I mean, if anybody had a right to a grievance, it was Joseph. His brothers sold him into slavery simply because Dad liked him best. That betrayal landed him in prison, where he could have died. Through a series of unexpected opportunities, he left prison with the patronage of Pharaoh, and he was now untouchable, one of the most powerful people in Egypt. Now, here's your test. How closely did you listen to how I made that story sound? Did you notice? I grouped all of Joseph's brothers into one homogeneous group. They sold him into slavery. They betrayed him. But if you look back at the story itself, most of the brothers wanted to kill Joseph. Reuben tried to protect him. And Judah, while maybe not a saint, convinced his brothers not to leave Joseph in a pit to die. Sell him to some traders. Let's get some money for him, but don't leave him in a pit to die. How often do we assume that everyone who wants to vote for the other side thinks alike or has the same depraved values? How much do we just group everybody together and not really realize that different things are going on in people? It's a good reminder that we can't assume we know everything about someone just because of who they vote for. I'll get back to that in a few minutes. Even though Joseph said he did not hold a grudge against his brothers when they came to Egypt looking for food, now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers were worried he would finally exact his revenge on them. Joseph behaved himself, treated his brothers fine because his dad was alive, dad was dead. Anything's possible. No one would blame Joseph if he killed his brothers. After all, they wronged him horribly. I don't think anyone would have blinked twice in that world. It's also possible his brothers might have tried to finish what they started years ago just to protect themselves in case Joseph did decide to murder them in their sleep. But the story turns out very differently, because instead of exacting revenge or trying to make his brothers feel guilty, Joseph reached across that chasm between them and he forgave them. He didn't even try to make them feel guilty when he forgave them. When have you ever hoped that someone who wronged you did not feel guilty? I think most of us do. But Joseph made a choice. As legitimate as his grievance was, he made a choice not to repay violence with violence. When you repay violence with violence, no matter how justified it may seem, all you do is perpetuate more violence, because now there's even more to be aggrieved about. Now there's even more hurt that's happened. And then it carries over into the next generation and the next and the next. That's part of what we're seeing in the Middle East. If you talk to people there, they aren't just fighting over the big issues. They're fighting because this person did this to me or to my father or to my grandfather. And the violence just continues generation after generation. And it gets so entrenched. How do you ever find your way out of that? Joseph opted for a different way forward. Instead of repaying violence with violence, he chose to forgive because they were family. His forgiveness is not what's sometimes called cheap grace, where there's no accountability or responsibility. He actually said to them, "You did this to me." Forgiveness doesn't mean we ignore the fact that we were hurt. It doesn't say that what was done was not wrong or unjust. It doesn't even mean that whatever now our grievances from it, that it doesn't have to be addressed fairly and honestly. But what it does say is the past doesn't have to define our future. It does say, you are still my brother, you are still my sister, you are still my sibling, and you still matter to me, regardless of what you have done. Or I might say, who you might vote for. We are still family. Think about those people who have disappeared from your life because of this current political divide. What does it mean to say they're still family? I know family are sometimes the hardest people to love, but if you want peace, and not just a truce where you get together but you agree we will never talk about the elephant in the room, if you want peace and not just a truce, we have to stop holding people's sins against them. We have to be willing to be honest with each other about how we've been affected by whatever has happened. We have to be willing to listen to each other, listen to their story of how they've been affected. And we need to believe each other's stories. Because as much as you may think you know what my life is like and what motivates me, you don't. Just like as much as I may think I know you and what your life is like and what motivates you, I don't. Each one of us is the expert in our own life. Nobody else is. So we have to be willing to listen to each other and listen to what's being said behind the words and believe those stories. Joseph's conversation with his brothers after his father died is interesting, and I think it's an example of that. They did not apologize for what they did. Don't know if you caught that. They did not ask for mercy. What they did say was, Dad said you should forgive us. In other words, this was Dad's last wish. You'd be a terrible son if you denied Dad his last wish. They actually tried to guilt him into forgiving them. But Joseph saw it for what it was. He saw that his brothers were afraid that he might finally exact vengeance on them. And that's what he spoke to. He spoke to their fears, and he assured them they had nothing to fear. They could forge a new future together. I wish we were as good at doing that as Joseph was. After worship last Sunday, I had several people come up and talk about the people who have disappeared from their lives, people who've been close friends for decades, because they're now on they're in opposite political camps. And they either don't know, or they either could not or don't know how to talk to each other anymore. It's as if the political differences now define the essence and the core of who that person is. And we don't always know how to deal with that. As I shared with you last week, it's not easy for me, too, when people I love support something that just seems to go against everything that I believe is right. But if we are to maintain those relationships, and I'm making an assumption those relationships are important. I think they are. If we're to maintain those relationships or to repair them, if we're not to throw away decades of friendship and love, then we have to stop judging each other, and we have to listen to each other. We have to talk to each other, and we have to believe what the other is telling us. What if we reached out to those who have disappeared and simply said, I miss you, can we talk? And then be honest about how the loss of that relationship has affected you personally. Start there. Don't talk about politics. That's not the most important thing. Talk about how the loss of that relationship has affected you personally. You can talk later about about politics and who's worst for our country. But share your heart and invite them to do the same. And listen to what they are saying behind the words they use. Because just like we sometimes find it hard to really say what we mean, they might too. Later you can ask them about what lies behind their political choices. Not to judge them, but to understand them. Ask them what their hopes are, what their dreams are, regardless of who gets elected. And ask them about their fears. Ask them about what they're afraid of. Ask them how they have been hurt. Don't ask them about their politics. Ask them how their story has led them on the path they have gone. And whatever you do, don't try to argue them out of their fears by saying they're stupid or blown out of proportion or based on lies, because it doesn't matter. Their fears are real to them, and that makes them valid. So whatever they are, listen to each other and believe them. That's what Joseph did for his brothers. He listened to their fear that they didn't want to admit to, and he believed them, and that's what he addressed. When you have those kinds of conversations, you actually may find that you share some of the same hopes and fears. And then you've got a foundation on which to rebuild that relationship. You still may not agree on politics, but it shouldn't be the thing that tears you apart. And isn't that what God did for us? Jesus' whole life, there's very little judgment in his life. But there's a lot of stories about Jesus sitting down with someone and listening to them, meeting them where they are at. There's a lot of Jesus forgiving others, even those who committed the worst betrayal against him. There's a lot of Jesus not holding our past against us. And there's a lot of Jesus asking, what do you need? What can I do for you? There's a lot of Jesus meeting us where we are at and loving us in spite of ourselves. Can you be that way with the people you love who may be on the other side of that chasm? How might things be different if you could do that? One more thing Joseph said just before I kind of wind this up. He told his brothers that while they meant to harm him, God brought good out of it. And I think that's important for us to remember, especially as we wrestle with these relationships with people who feel very differently about the political world than we do. Believe that no matter what happens, God will bring some good out of it. Whatever happens, whoever is elected, God will bring good out of it. If we could start holding on to that foundational belief, then we can have those conversations with those who have disappeared. We can talk about what scares us, and we could talk about what our hopes are. If we truly believe that no matter what happens, even if it's not what we want, God can bring good out of it, and God will. So hang on to that. Hang on to that. While you and your family and friends may never see eye to eye on politics, know that God is still God. God is still at work in this world, and where God is, there is good. There is hope. So trust God to bring about something good out of this election. Trust God to also bring something good out of your efforts to reach out to those who are missing from your life. They probably miss you too, and they just don't know how to reach across that chasm back to you. They may not know how to find common ground. They may have been hurt so badly with the violent rhetoric of these days that they're afraid to let their guards down. You may have been too. But trust God to guide you, to shield you, and to bring good out of those efforts. Because God is in the business of healing relationships and reconciling people and opening new doors to new futures. And if I might add, God can still do that no matter how badly we mess up. Amen.